Welcome, mentors. Today we continue with my efforts to highlight some of the important, meaningful, and impactful work of law enforcement that is going on in our communities. These efforts of mine do not deny or negate that in law enforcement, we do have some serious, even heinous, troublesome pockets of decay that need to be pruned. But it's not all bad. And for some reason, we're not hearing about the good. My guest today, Chief Tom Synan of the Schenectady, Ohio metropolitan area, is a perfect example. The more I learned about him, the more of my respect he earned. First, let me say that I've included some links because we're not going to be able to get into all of the topics in depth. And there are some very important links here about him and some of his work, things that he has done and other interviews he's had. I hope you will delve into them. I also hope that you will reach out to him. He is very anxious to support whatever work you are doing, and I know he would be willing and interested in learning about any initiative that you want to begin in your area. But let me share some of the highlights about Chief Synan. He began his work in law enforcement in Newton, Ohio as a police officer. He soon became part of their SWAT team as the tactical team leader. His next step was chief of the Newton Police Department. Chief Synan has his own podcast called Hard Corners, which with a little due diligence of my own, I found is a law enforcement term. And I did listen to several of his podcasts. I will say they are excellent and factual, and he's not afraid to delve into some of the more controversial issues right now that we are all talking about. He's also been a TEDx speaker. Since I spoke with him last, I continue to read more of recognitions he's received as being panelists and been invited to Washington, D.C. He started a Hamilton County Addiction Response Coalition and is receiving praise for his work all over the country, as well as obviously his own community. His most admirable achievement, at least to me, is his work directly with addiction and how he is changing the training of police officers and the conversation for law enforcement around engaging in solutions and not just punishment. Addiction, no doubt, is his area of expertise. I believe it was Albert Einstein who said, the very definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Well, our approach to addiction is not working. Hello, families and kids are having their lives turned upside down. Telling the addict that it's up to them to solve the problem is not working. It's a community problem, and it will take a community working together to make a difference. What Chief Synan is doing is reaching out to the community and admitting that the police do not have all the answers. They do not have all the tools at their disposal that they need to be effective. It's time to explore another approach. That's why I've invited Chief Tom Synan here with us today. And that is exactly what we're going to do, explore another approach. Welcome, Chief. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's been, it's always a challenge. Everybody's so busy, and I do appreciate your sticking with me. When we spoke earlier, you shared with me a little bit about your journey to becoming a police officer. You talked a little bit about your childhood fantasy and about the superhero that you wanted to emulate. Perhaps you could talk a little bit first about this journey that you had as a young man growing up and your interest in becoming a police officer.
Yeah, sure. So my superhero obsession is with Batman. And ends up being a little bit more complicated than just the childhood Batman, although I did watch the reruns of the original Batman TV series, which was a little bit more funny. But I've gotten more into as my career has progressed, more into the Dark Knight or the latest movies with Batman because of the complexity that Batman faces with whether it's vengeance, what's right, what's wrong, what's moral, what's not moral. Once you get into the human aspect and understand human beings a little bit more, it ends up being a lot more complicated. So I was convinced as a kid I wanted to be a police officer to make a difference in the world. I believed a police officer could change the world. And that was my mission. I am 100% convinced I was born to do it. It was something that probably was my first memory. I was going to be a cop and change the world. And luckily, I've had the chance to do that. It's been not quite the journey I expected, as probably most people. It tends to go in different directions and is not quite what you think it is. It's been rough at times, especially. And what I've learned is through tragedies, there is an opportunity to make change. And throughout my life, it's been the tragedies that have allowed me to take a different direction, to speak up and advocate and make changes. So yeah, it's been quite the journey.
You also told me that you were a little naive and that self-reflection helped to bring you more into the real world. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh yeah, I was definitely naive. I've been naive most of my life, and there's been some kind of trying to get rid of it, but I think I want to hold on to it because I do believe that being a little naive is also having some hope. Growing up, I was a really small kid. I realize now I probably dealt with a lot of depression. I spent a lot of time by myself. I was kind of an underdog. So I think I took that kind of perspective in this work of having that understanding of being within myself or being alone a lot. You tend to be self-aware, self-reflective. You question a lot of what is going on in life, and then how did you interact with it? So that naive belief, I think, led me to that hope. And that's one of the good qualities I've always had, is there's always been hope no matter what. Going through tragedy, whether it's personal in my personal life or through work, having that little bit of being naive allowed me to be hopeful enough that not only I can make it through it, but I can make some sense out of it and make something good out of it. And I think that's kind of the challenge, is we can get overwhelmed or overburdened. And without being a little bit naive, without having that hope, then I think the road kind of doesn't lead where we want it to go. But having a little bit of hope allows you to kind of push forward and builds that resilience. And really that's what it's about. It's building that resilience.
You said also that as a young officer, you were told not to get personally involved in the things that were going on. And you've kind of done a 180 on that, and you talk about empathy a lot. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I had a sergeant when I first started who he was very angry, very upset all the time. He had told me when I first started, do not get personally involved. I think he said it, and I think a lot of first responders believe this, that if you compartmentalize or you do not get personally involved, it kind of protects you. I didn't agree with that. And I'll give you an example. That same sergeant retired in his early 50s. He had died before he was 60 years old. They found out he had numerous strokes and had died ultimately of a very large stroke. And I'm convinced it was a lot of that containing it and holding it in.
Oh,
I, I was under the impression that I wanted to, this is an incredible job that you literally get to experience every part of life. People's births, birthdays, weddings, all the celebrations, but you also get to see the other side of it, the despair, the divorces, the deaths. So you really are on a roller coaster of life, and you get to experience everything. And I felt that if I could feel what was going on in life, I would not only experience it, but it would help me get through it. I was not one to hold stuff in, and I was not one who was afraid to show emotions or be compassionate with somebody. And the more I did that with other people, I found that it allowed me to be more compassionate and empathetic with myself. And for me, empathy is not that you condone or accept someone's behavior. Empathy is that I just have an understanding of that person's plight in life, their plot in life, where they're coming from. And this job, you really, if you take a view as an observer at times, you get to see how someone is living. And when you look at it from their perspective, it gives you a different view. and a lot much better understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. And then you can find more solutions within that empathy, because within empathy is understanding.
You tell a story about a starfish story, and I think I'm going to ask you to share that with our listeners, because I think that is so indicative of your perspective of making personal connections with people, and making each person feel unique in that respect. I know you have other stories to tell, but this parable, I think, is very appropriate now. If you could share that starfish parable.
Yeah, so the starfish parable is very well known in the addiction world. And it is a story of a young boy. There's different versions of it, but the version I tell is of a young boy who's walking along a beach where thousands of starfish have washed up. And he understands that if he doesn't get the starfish back into the water, back into the ocean, they'll die. So he begins picking up a starfish, throws it in the ocean, picks up another, throws it in the ocean, picks up another, throws it in the ocean. An old man who's seeing this cannot believe what he's seeing. And he walks up to him and says, "Young man, what are you doing? There's too many. You're wasting your time. You can't save them all." And a young boy picks up a starfish, throws it in the ocean, looks at the old man and says, "I saved that one."
Oh, I
And
just
we
love
use it a lot. We use it a lot in
that. I
addiction.
love that.
Yeah, we use it a lot in addiction. And I kind of changed it a little bit of that. I want to be that young boy that's not just picking up one starfish, but can I be the catalyst that allows other people to walk along the beach and pick up the
Okay.
starfish with me?
Okay. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but this is appropriate, I think, to
Yeah.
say that you talk about um, the law enforcement showing their vulnerability
Hmm.
and admitting that they don't have all the tools, and reaching out to the community to try and coordinate an effort altogether, that the police don't have to, the community shouldn't feel that the law enforcement are going to solve the problem, and police shouldn't feel that they're either failing or not doing their job by not solving the problem, that this is a community effort. Am I saying that accurately?
Yeah. I don't think we teach, I know we don't teach as a first responder how to feel helpless. And there's many times as a first responder, as a police officer, you feel helpless. And often you don't have the tools. The only tools you really have are the law or jail, handcuffs, gun, taser. And
Mm.
those aren't necessarily appropriate for a lot of what we deal with, whether it's a social issue or chronic social issue, mental, medical, addiction, mental health, poverty, race. A lot of times law enforcement is the one on the forefront, the front lines, and people say, you need to deal with this. And for us not having those tools, resources, or knowledge, then you feel helpless. And when you feel helpless, that's where it becomes a challenge. And I'll go back to the story of the sergeant. I think a lot of times he felt helpless, like he couldn't really make a difference. And for me, feeling that and going through and grieving things and seeing people's stories and being empathetic, I felt that if I went through it and I was vulnerable enough to do it, that maybe I wouldn't be so helpless, and that understanding would allow me to make change. And so I now encourage that ability to be vulnerable. And I think a lot of times, especially in my field in law enforcement, we look at vulnerability as weakness. But as someone who's put myself out there being vulnerable, I'm telling you, it
Mm.
takes a tremendous amount of strength and courage to be able to stand up and say, I need help with this. I can't do this, or this is the way I feel when I go to a call, or I feel helpless. So for me, vulnerability is probably one of the strongest abilities to open up doors and to make changes. And it's that vulnerability that really I've embraced it now. It was challenging to kind of go outside of my tribe of law enforcement and
Wow.
say to be vulnerable. And I wrote an article in 2014 after the family died, and that was extremely vulnerable. And I'm not saying that when you're vulnerable, you don't take hits, you do, but those hits allow you to, one, know that you're on the right path. But if you could continue to be vulnerable, trust me, most people want to be able to do it. There's just not an example. And when you stand up and you're vulnerable and you open up, so many other people start opening up too. And going back to that op-ed I wrote in the Inquirer in 2014, I was just telling the story the other day. I opened up as a police chief. I opened up as a police officer. I'd seen an entire family, entire generation die from addiction, wrote this op-ed, and I got hundreds of letters, emails, phone calls from people who said, let me tell you my story of addiction, or
Oh,
let me tell you my family story of addiction. And I realized it took one person being vulnerable. And next thing you know, this entire community opened up and was vulnerable. And from there, we were able to find answers.
it's not something that you normally hear about, that people in a community reach out to law enforcement or a particular person in law enforcement to share their struggles. From my experience, we usually look at law enforcement as the problem that's keeping us from doing what we want to do, not reaching out to them to help us move in a different direction. You keep referring to this family, and I know the story, but could you talk a little bit about this family and how you happen to become involved?
Yeah, so I'm the police chief of a small town 11 miles east of downtown Cincinnati, Newtown, Ohio, where this family, I dealt with them for, at the time, 21-year mark, a mother and all three of her sons. And I remember the first call I went on was a domestic violence. And I had grown up in a chaotic home, but to see this home was even shocking to me. And I remember the first call, the mother was being beaten by a boyfriend, and she was addicted to alcohol and prescription pills. And these three young boys were sitting on a couch. In my first call, they were just shocked and terrified themselves. But throughout the years, as the calls progressed, I started watching the boys who would sit on the couch and they would just be numb to this chaos. And I was shocked that they didn't seem to experience or even notice the chaos, that they were numb to it. But I watched each family member die of addiction throughout my career, the 21-year mark, the mother from abuse and prescription pills and alcohol. The youngest boy, the youngest brother's son, was shot and killed by crack cocaine. The oldest overdosed on heroin and fentanyl. The last of the brothers, he had actually set my personal car on fire when I was a young police
Oh my
officer. I
gosh.
just filed bankruptcy. I had this car. He set it on fire. I had no money, no car. And I had to deal with him for 21 years. And that's where the empathy really hit home, because I'd seen how he grew up. I'd seen where he came from. And he ended up overdosing a couple weeks before Thanksgiving in 2014. I got a call at home from one of my officers who said, hey, his name was Charles, but everybody called him Chucky. Chucky overdosed in the street. The fire department brought him back with Narcan. He's down here at the station crying, saying that he doesn't want to die. What should we do? And at the time, we didn't have a community coalition. We're a small community. We don't have a lot of resources. So I said, we got to figure out some way to keep him alive, take him to a hospital, find treatment. If we got to pay for it, whatever we got to do. Because I realized Chucky wasn't just the last of a family. He was literally the last of an entire generation.
Oh,
So ended up about an hour later, they called back and said, hey, Chucky's refusing help. And having a better understanding of addiction now than I did then, it's almost as if the familiarity of despair is just as powerful as the fear of hope. Because for Chucky, if he
wow,
goes into
that's
treatment,
powerful.
it's the truth. He's familiar with that despair. He's lived with it his whole life. But if we tell him go get treatment, we'll take care of it, he has to get over the guilt, the shame. He has to get over the physical withdrawals, the mental withdrawals. He has to be able to somehow keep up with it. And we know he's going to relapse. But then that's not just a relapse from addiction. It is a relapse of guilt and shame and feeling like you're not worthy. So at the time, my tools were exactly what you and I said. It was handcuffs, taser, jail. And I said, look, we got to keep him alive for at least one more night. So take him to jail. We took him to jail, accomplished our mission, kept him alive for one more night. The next morning, he got out, overdosed, and died. And
Oh, every
I had,
time you tell me that, I get the chills.
oh, it had a profound impact on me. It was shocking. I got to admit that I was surprised by the reaction, because here's a kid who set my car on fire, who had beat me up, ran from me. I mean, I dealt with him for 21 years, and it had a powerful emotional toll on me. I think partly because here I am growing up thinking I'm Batman. I'm going to be a cop and save the world. And yet I couldn't even save this family. And to have an entire family die in my community was heartbreaking. And that's what led me to write the article and be vulnerable and say, this is how I saw them grow up. This is the things we tried to do and it didn't work. Here's what we've been doing with addiction for 50, 60, 70 years and it hasn't worked. It's time that we do something different. And it was that tragedy that was a catalyst. But those brothers, each one of the three brothers had kids. The oldest had five. Out of the five, three are struggling with substance use disorder. So we have dealt with 3 generations of addiction in my small town. So it is really what led me to this crusade of changing the way we view and deal with addiction, not just in the Newtown, Cincinnati, Hamilton County area, but across the country and across the world, and letting people know that we need to change the way we view and deal with addiction if we're going to make a difference.
Change it in, you give me the words that you use. Change it in what respect? What are we doing now that you want to see us do differently?
Sure. So it can't be just law enforcement. And I think that's where we get a lot of trouble with law enforcement, is because we're taught to enforce laws. Yet much of our work is not law enforcement, it's social work, whether it is addiction, mental health, poverty, transportation, housing, all of those things. And this is, I saw addiction as law enforcement led. It is society kind of said, well, your guys are out there, you take care of this. When someone is addicted, take them to jail and I should fix it. And we're just going off of what the law is or what the legislation is put in place. But my tragedy of this family dying really hit home that we don't have the solutions. We don't have the tools, the knowledge, or the resources to deal with a chronic mental medical health condition. And I was convinced that's what it was. So the solution was, instead of being law enforcement led, why can't law enforcement be a link to longer term care, to resources, to a continuum care model? Why can't we connect people? And that's what led to the formation of at the time we called it the Hamilton County Heroin Coalition. There's
Right.
about 12 members. It's now the Hamilton County Addiction Response Coalition. And we have over 700 individuals in nearly 250 separate organizations. And last year, for the first time since the coalition came together 8 years ago, we had a 16% reduction in overdose deaths. We're trending another 18% lower this year. And if we continue that trend, we will actually be lower than when we started the coalition. So it kind of validated that law enforcement shouldn't be the lead as far as criminalization, and that society needed to change its view and look at addiction not as a crime or as a way to punish that addiction, but instead treat it as the chronic mental medical health condition it is. Bring a community together, put together a continuum care model, and you'll have better results. And that's not just addiction. That is all the peripheral issues that go with addiction, whether it's mental health, housing, transportation, employment. All those things come together, and that's what we work on. And when you bring a community together to work on those chronic issues, you end up making a bigger impact. You not only save lives, but you get people their lives back.
So if you were to define the problem, the addiction problem, I would imagine it has many different facets. How would you bring the definition of an addiction problem in your community into perspective so people would be able to understand it? What are some of those facets that are involved in the mental health? Obviously is one, but are there others that you would say permeate the problem that perhaps people don't take into consideration when they just see the drug addict on the street? That empathy, what are some of the things they need to be thinking about in terms of that person?
Well, I was very fortunate to have an addiction doctor who taught me about addiction and how it impacts the body and the brain. And we know that adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, play a significant role. If you grow up in a home of addiction, mental health, domestic violence, there is an increased percentage chance that you will repeat that. It's kind of like that cycle. And that's what I talked about, the familiarity of despair. Also, trauma, genetics, and environment play a significant role. And if you have one of the three, you could be more likely to be susceptible to addiction. So there is a science part of this. And understanding that either trauma, the environment, or genetics could play a role, understanding that adverse childhood experiences could play a role, then you start having that empathy. Now that I understand addiction's not just willpower, it's not just someone who doesn't want to be well, it is actually these experiences that happen in life that impact the brain, that impact the body. There's studies, there's MRIs, there's all kinds of scientific evidence showing that the frontal cortex shuts down, that the hippocampus, the amygdala, the fight or flight response is more lit up, and people are literally in survival mode and have been in survival mode for months. And to your point, there's also this connection of mental health. whether it's anxiety or depression. We often talk about that we know with addiction, about 2/3 of those addicted have a diagnosed mental health condition. And we often say that the other 1/3 probably is just undiagnosed. So there is anxiety, there's depression, PTSD, there's trauma that's involved. And really, addiction becomes, how can I fill in the void of my pain, the way my brain and body is feeling in these intense situations. And a lot of times addiction is a matter of trying to numb that pain, trying to make sense of it. But once it starts, then it becomes relied on and the brain changes. There is a chemical and a physical change that ends up happening. So we understand for opiate addiction, on average, it takes 7 to 8 times for someone to make it through rehab.
Oh my
And,
gosh.
and we understand from science that it takes 1 to 3 years, and I'll use a layman term, that the brain gets to be rewired again, so that the
Wow.
frontal cortex comes more back online and that you're using more of your executive decision-making process. When you understand that, it allows you to open up a little bit and see that person as a person, a human being. And then you could start relating, because although I didn't grow up, I grew up in a home of alcohol and mental health, but I did not, fortunately, myself grow up being addicted. But it doesn't mean that I don't have some of the same things that other people have, whether it is struggling through trauma, whether it's struggling through suffering, whether it's having tragedy, or how do I process grief. When you start seeing that they're not so much unlike you, they just had a different condition than you, then you start seeing the human being. You start noticing the person more than you notice the addiction.
Of course, I'm interested in the kids. And obviously, from your story, this generations of young people that were affected by addiction. We talked earlier about taking kids out of their homes and putting them in foster care. And sometimes we think that putting them in foster care is the solution, getting them out of their home. But what you're describing, that's just the beginning of the problem. And kids who have lost their parents, either physically, where they've died from drugs, or whether they've been separated from them, whether the parents are still alive, still have this issue of the mental health concern of whether it be race or poverty, or mental health issues around their perspective of drugs, or maybe anger that they're dealing with. And do you take that into consideration when you find kids on the street, perhaps like you did with this young man, where you wanted to put him into jail for the night to keep him alive? I would imagine he wasn't a young kid, but are there young kids who are out on the street or going through these challenges because of either their families are involved in drugs or they've been recruited for drugs? How do you deal with those young people?
Yeah, there's certainly that. There's definitely a group that is part of that. And that family is a prime example. The oldest brother had 5 kids. The oldest daughter at the time, she started using drugs when she was 12. Now, both of her parents were using drugs. She talks openly about how they would overdose in front of her. They would give her money to go buy heroin downtown for them. So she's now 14, going back and forth from downtown Cincinnati back to Newtown to give her parents heroin, and they're overdosing. She begins using, and she tells a story of when she turned 16, she was given money from her parents to go buy heroin. She never came back. She used it herself and then lived on the streets for
Oh,
a good about a decade.
wow.
And yeah, so she was one of those. It's not that this is not the case for everybody. Everyone's experiences can be different, but for her, to your point, that's what happened. She was a young kid, and now she's living on the streets of downtown Cincinnati. She's homeless. She's depending on other people who use drugs to kind of teach her the ways, to show her the ways, to kind of take care of her. And now she has this new clan, and she talks about how her all of her uncles die, her grandmother dies, all the entire family has died, and she's now living on the streets. And then all of a sudden, these people who are her friends and her new pseudo family, they start dying from overdosing. And not only is she dealing with the guilt and shame because she's had to do some things to survive on the street, survive in that addiction that she feels terrible about, that she didn't feel worthy of being a human being. And then on top of it, she's got survivor's guilt, because now all these people she's known and loved are gone. And she's wondering, why is she the one that survived all of this? So there's a lot more that goes to addiction than someone just doing a drug. And it's not necessarily a matter of a choice. Look, you can't argue at some point there was a choice made. But when we say that it's just a choice, what we're taking out is all the background information, all the history, all the experiences that led to that point where someone made a choice. And then we're taking out the experiences. Does that child have support? Are they getting mental health support? Are they getting support as far as housing? Is someone guiding them? She even talked about going to other people's houses where the parents made dinner and gave them gifts, and she was in shock. She never had any of that as a kid. But the other thing we got to talk about too is when, let's say, like for her, she's now in her late 20s. One of the things she talks about is now she's been in recovery for several years. Now she's getting an apartment and a job and a car, but no one ever taught her how to write a check, how to budget. No one ever even taught her how to cook or how to buy clothes. And she's now living in a bad part of town because it's all she can afford, where there's drug dealers and shootings and all this stuff going on. So there's constant temptation. So one of the things we don't do well as a society is we are doing better at congratulating people towards recovery, but we're not doing so well as making sure they're supported all the way through active recovery. And that is making sure that they can live like everyone else. I mean, most of us grew up with that kind of basically training. You were trained by your parents how to take care of yourself. That was the job. But for some who grew up on the streets like that, they have none of that. So we got to make sure that we as a society help make sure that we support people through active recovery so they can live on their own and thrive.
And we were all given a sense of self-worth as well.
Correct.
When we were growing up. And in one of your podcasts, you say that we can't learn to take care of ourselves if we don't love ourselves, if we don't respect ourselves, if we don't have a sense of worth. And one of the things that seems like you're talking about is examples of this exact thing, that these kids haven't been given any sense of self-worth. They haven't been taught to put themselves first. And this is something that they need to have support with, finding out who they are and that they're valuable as human beings. If teenagers, you say, don't love or value themselves, how can they have value for someone else? That's your quote.
Yeah, and I can relate to that. So I was a very small kid growing up. I mean, when I went in the Marines, I was 120 pounds, and I got beat up.
I weigh more than that.
Yeah, I was really small. So I was short. I was small. I can relate to the self-worth in that I didn't feel like I was worthy enough to have, whether it was relationships, to be a Marine, to be a cop, to change the world, all this stuff. And I've learned that there's a difference between confidence and self-worth. I went through most of my life with these accomplishments based off of confidence, but it wasn't necessarily a matter of self-worth because I didn't have that growing up either. I didn't have that instilled in me. I didn't have someone saying you're good enough, you can accomplish whatever you want. It was to go back to the beginning. I was naive enough to have hope. And I think that carried me through a lot of this. And when I was so self-reflective, I found out that I wasn't much different than the people who were struggling with addiction, whether it was guilt, shame, not having the self-worth. The only difference I had was confidence and resiliency. And obviously being a Marine, you learn to overcome and adapt. And I think I did much of my life like that. So when I look at those struggling with substance use disorder, when I look at those in recovery, I look at them as being tremendously heroic, because no matter if you're going through mental health recovery, if you're recovering from a divorce, if you're recovering from family death or loved one's death, you're on a journey that those in active recovery are on too. And that is, one, in order to get through it, you must be vulnerable enough to tell yourself that I'm in pain, I'm hurting, and I need to figure out, I need to get help, and I need to be supported through this. Then you start learning, going through the grief process, that you can be resilient. that I do pick myself up. I continue to pick myself up. That is really not just confidence. That is building self-worth. And especially when you can be vulnerable with another person, feel safe in that vulnerability, and that they can see you as a person and hear you as a person, that's where you really start building that self-worth. And for me, that's what this journey has really been about. I went on this journey to make a difference in the world, to save the world. But I often ask myself, and it'll go back to a Batman kind of reference,
Yeah.
is who was I saving, the world or me?
Yeah.
And I've been very fortunate. I think that it helped save me as well as save some people in the world too. So it's been a little bit of a both of a journey, and it's taken me now 56 years to realize that. But now I look back and you can see everything come together, and you can see all the people that came into my life, this mission and this purpose from addiction. And for the first time, many people, including myself, are doing this from a place of vulnerability because we have enough self-worth to believe in ourselves that we can make changes.
That quote, I know you shared that with me once before, and that's you could almost write a whole book on that one quote. Who am I saving? The world, or am I saving myself? One of the other things, I really want people to know where you're coming from. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your philosophy a little bit. One of the things that you mentioned to me was that both sides have fear. And one of the ways that we can overcome that fear is by admitting that we have the fear, because the fear is irrational. And if we can rationalize it, we can address it. And it seems like this young man, the example you gave of the young man who the familiarity of despair couldn't compete with the possibility of hope. He wasn't able to cross that boundary. How do you get, when you're working with your officers and you're doing some trainings, how do you bring them to the point where they can admit their vulnerability and address their fears, so that they can become better officers on the street working with these this community, the community and this problem?
I tell them, I actually just had a training recently, and I said, look, I don't want you to think outside the box. All I want you to do is open the lid to the box and look outside. If you can just open the lid and look outside of yourself, you can start seeing there's another world. And from a law enforcement perspective, we're taught from the beginning this fear that we're going to get hurt or killed. You're constantly in this fear that something bad could happen to you. And we wonder why there's negative interactions with law enforcement, because we're just as scared as everybody else. But the thing is we often turn our fear into control, and that in itself is a fear tactic. If we think if we can control everything, then it relinquishes our fear, and then everything will fall into place. But what you often find, and this is what I find a lot of times from officers coming out of the academy, because they're just as insecure. They're having the same issues as everybody else. They're just as insecure. I'm not confident in my skills. I'm not confident in my job. I'm dealing with things I've never dealt with before. And we're asking these young 20-year-olds to make these life and death situations, to go into homes where they're seeing poverty and they're seeing mental health and addiction, and they walk away not having a solution. And that compounds that fear, that compounds that inability to feel like you have the confidence to do what you need to do.
I also imagine they have a fear of not going home.
And then on top of it, you have a fear of not going home.
Yes.
So I tell them, lift up the lid, look outside, because as much fear as you feel, so does someone else. And we can't be making decisions out of fear. Someone's got to say, look, I'm going to be comfortable being uncomfortable. I will be that person. I do think from a law enforcement perspective, often it's up to us to lead that, is to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and seeing these situations. And again, if you allow yourself to do that, to be comfortable and uncomfortable, what you end up getting is empathy. So we really hit hard on empathy. And I do define empathy as I'm not condoning or accepting the behavior. I'm just looking at it from another person's perspective. So when they open up that box and they look out the box, what I'm asking them to do is, the fear that you feel. Can you relate to someone else feeling the same thing? If you can you be the one that reduces the fear on your side? Because generally what will happen is on the other side, the fear will be reduced. Now, if that fear on the other side is not reduced, then you have a legitimate reason for being physically afraid. Then we can start separating what fear is. So now it is actual, I'm in fear of my safety or someone else's safety, someone else's life. I need to be tactically sound to make sure I can make good decisions during that. But often what ends up happening is if that's not the case, I want to try to diminish fear on my side, because when I do and the other side does, now we can start talking and communicating. And I don't need to use necessarily all the police tactics or as many of the police tactics. But I also tell them it's not always going to work. And I don't mean not going to work that you're going to take somebody to jail, but there may be times you walk away from a situation knowing that you weren't able to make a difference. So in that feeling helpless, can you be vulnerable enough to admit it? Because then if you can, you're not holding it in and it's not building up and you're not building resentment. So again, it all kind of comes down to empathy, man. Just lift the box of your, just lift the lid of the box, look outside, and I'm telling you, you'll start seeing a different perspective.
You quoted a Chief Eric Jones, and you said that in one of your podcasts, and you said that police need to be public servants and guardians with a warrior hat if needed. And I think that's appropriate to what you're talking about. The idea of being a public servant, but keeping your eyes and ears open and making sure that you're not putting yourself in a position where you are being threatened and you're not taking it seriously. Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, it is. Look, man, I think we've got to accept that there is danger, and it's not always danger of getting shot. There's a danger of being assaulted. There's a danger of being poked with a needle. There's danger of being in a car crash. There's all kinds of dangers in this job because it really is unpredictable. So we have to accept that an officer needs to be both the warrior and be able to be compassionate and empathetic. And whether it is a business school shooting or a school shooting, I mean, you see these officers going into the fire, and that's their job. So you have to be tactically sound. That is true physical fear. And then we have to be able to negotiate, calm that down, bring that down, and then go into a family where it's a domestic violence situation, still be on that warrior side, but then be compassionate for the kids and everyone that's around. So it is challenging. There is no doubt that this is a challenging job. And the best officers are the ones that are able to be tactical and the ones that are able to also be empathetic towards other. There's a saying, it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. And that's
just filled with witticisms.
that's you got to have these in order to make it through this job. I'm telling you, that's the whole complexity of Batman. This is not easy. When you work in that gray area, it's a lot easier to maneuver up to tactical and come back down to not being tactical. So I've been very fortunate to have the Marine Corps background, the SWAT background. We do teach with that with my officers. And if I can get them confident in tactics, then generally you find you don't use the tactics as much. On SWAT, we generally solved almost all of these life and death situations without any kind of violence whatsoever. It's usually a negotiator or some type of tactic that we did. And yet we were extremely skilled at shooting. We were extremely skilled at violent tactics, but we hardly ever used them because we were so confident in them. We never went to that line unless it was 100% absolutely necessary. But what we're asking officers on the street, we're asking them to basically think, act, and be like a SWAT officer, but not given that training, both from the physical aspect, the equipment aspect, but also the mental aspect.
So I think we can agree that you're going about training officers with a little different perspective than sometimes is being used today. The tools that officers have, from the taser to the gun in jail, you're kind of asking them to keep keep handy in case they need it, but you're also giving them some other tools to use as well. And the community services that you put together, which I want to talk about also, is one of the tools putting people in touch with some of the services within the community. I want to talk a little bit about your Hard Corners podcast, because I got so much information from listening to that. And one of the guests that you had, Neil Gross, a sociologist and an author, was talking about trying new things based on data. And I'm wondering, are you collecting data, or do you have resources that you're using as to help you make some of the decisions about how you're changing your approach to what's going on in your community? Are you keeping data that you're sharing with others?
Yeah, so the coalition has been significant. We share data with public health, with the juvenile foster system, the courts, and we also have a specific program in a neighborhood that's been expanding where we know every single person. I'll use overdosing, for example. Every single person that overdosed, and we've identified more of the high overdose priority people who have overdosed anywhere from 6 to 30 times. And we've used that data to now be proactive and send outreach to people. So we're giving them harm reduction materials, we're connecting them to treatment, we're following them all the way through active recovery, but we're also looking at the environmental factors that go along with it. So it's not just an individual. We go down to the neighborhood, the block, and the street, and we say what other factors are contributing to this person living in either mental health or addiction, and can we, one, wrap services around that human being and support them all the way through towards active recovery? And can we take out the negatives that would keep somebody in that cycle? So data becomes significant for us. And I just had a meeting. We just had our meeting Thursday with Cincinnati Police and this group that works on it. And that's what we do. We have pages of data, and we look at someone that's overdosed. We, one, make sure that the quick response team outreach is in contact with them, giving them harm reduction, able to connect them to services. And we do everything from help them get through the court process, get their state ID, Medicaid, walk them through all the way to treatment, to active recovery. And Cincinnati Police is working on abandoned buildings or environmental issues. And we're taking this all in consideration and formulating a plan. So now it's not just wrapped around one person, but it's holistic in the community and able to make a bigger difference. And it all started from that data, which we did not have before. And it's been a game changer for us. We saw an 89% reduction in overdoses in that community, an 11% reduction in overdose deaths. It saved the Cincinnati Fire Department in its first phase $36,000. And that's from using data.
And this is your Hampden County Addiction Response Group that you're using as a resource. Can you talk to us about that? You know, what gave birth to that, and how has it grown?
Yeah, so that Hampden County, Hampden County was kind of a presentation we did. We call it the Price Hill Project. It's on the west side of Cincinnati. And it started from me being on a coalition from the beginning and seeing a particular neighborhood, the west side of Cincinnati, that traditionally had been a hotspot, had traditionally had numerous overdoses, deaths, one of the first places in the United States to see carfentanil. And I kept thinking, why is this neighborhood the one that traditionally has been like this? And at the time, we were 6 years into the coalition. And there was this saying of, we need to meet people where they are, which I 100% agree with. But then I started seeing that we were meeting people where they are, but we were leaving them there. And that really hit home for me. And I decided we need to make a change. We can't just meet somebody where they're at and leave them there. We have to be able to support them through. I'm not saying they have to go through it. All I'm saying is we will open a door for you. We will walk alongside you. We'll support you all the way through if that's what you want to be able to do. So it was born out of that kind of concept. And it was also a concept that we were losing. The officers obviously were dealing with compassion fatigue, and so is the community. So could we do more to take everyone, the community, first responders, those with substance use disorder? Could we figure out a plan that allowed to take out the negatives in the community, wrap that person around more positives? And if we could do that simultaneously, we would make a bigger impact. So that's really what the project is about, is replacing the negatives in the community, wrapping services around that person so they have more positives, and then walking them through that. And the hope is When you start seeing more positives, you will not want to repeat that cycle. Plus, if you do relapse and you go into that cycle, there'll be less negative community influencers on you, and you'll want to more likely stay in that positive where we're there ready for you anytime you want. We'll come pick you up. We'll walk you through the process. And when you do that, you build a continuum care model. It's more of a holistic model. But I'll say this is coming from law enforcement. These are law enforcement led projects because we said we're being vulnerable. We don't have the answers. But I still struggle with this because I'll be quite honest with you. It shouldn't be me, law enforcement, leading this. It should be mental health. It should be the medical community. But you're that's a whole different conversation of insurance and who's getting paid.
Yep.
We're not making money off of this. We want to make a difference in people's lives. We want to improve our community. There's many officers, for the stories you hear about, and they need to be called out. There is 100% some bad police officers, but there's also a lot of good ones who are doing a lot of work every single day to make a difference in the community and in someone's life. So that's what this project's about. It was about Cincinnati police coming together with our outreach, and can we use data? Can we take out many of the negatives, put more positives in the person's life and community, and make a bigger difference? And we have.
I had a professor, you say we shouldn't be doing this. Other people should be. I had a professor when we were having a discussion in class one day, a lot of people were saying the same kinds of things about this shouldn't, or this wouldn't happen if, and all this kind of stuff. And he got up there and he said, shouldn't, woulda, coulda. Shouldn't, wouldn't, coulda. He said, doesn't make any difference. If it needs to be done, do it. That's what he used to say. And I think it's so true. We spend so much time talking about what this one should be doing or what that one shouldn't be doing, or it's not my job, it's his job, and you're taking the bull by the horns, to use another metaphor, and doing what needs to be done. You once said to me that your officers are out on the street, and if they find an addict, one of the first that's out on the street, one of the first things they say to him is, you're not in trouble. So I would imagine that because your officers are out on the street and they know the kind of a department that you're running, when someone is found, their first response isn't to take off or to run or to defend themselves, that they're not in fear for their lives. And I would say that's probably it takes time to build that kind of trust, but I would say that's one of the reasons you're having such a positive effect. We also talked about how to define justice. And you said, we talked about, does it mean fair or does it mean equal? And you responded by saying, if we say treat me equally, when we are saying our group has power over the other, that's what we're saying. If we say treat me equally, then we're saying one group has power over the other. It shouldn't be about power. It should be about value. And I thought that was so powerful, because that's what you're talking about, is the value of the lives of the people that you're working with, and the empathy, and making yourself vulnerable. And I want to talk a little bit about your podcast, because what is the purpose of your podcast? What is your goal here? What is it you're trying to do? Because I want to say that I found that you brought issues in, not based on what issues might be comfortable for you as a police officer, but also issues that were controversial. And I thought that was very admirable, to be able to be talking about those so openly on your podcast as a police chief. So talk to me a little bit about your podcast and what your role is here, what your goal is. And if you can also segue into your being invited into Washington, D.C. To do some, to speak to people there about what it is that you're doing. And the podcast is just one of the things that you're doing.
Yeah, so it's called Hard Corners, and Hard Corners was a term we used on SWAT. And hard corners are the places you can't see, and they were the most dangerous. And those were the things that you often took on first. If you could get rid of the dangerous part, bring it out in the open, then you could deal with it, the operation went much better. So that's kind of the concept of the podcast, is can we get into, I think often, and this is one of the things I used to hear from when I was doing meetings within the coalition in the beginning. Let's go after the low hanging fruit. And it used to drive me crazy because, yeah, you can go after the low hanging fruit and then say it's success, but you didn't take on the bigger issues, the complex issues. And I'm a firm believer if you take on the complex issues, if you talk about them, if you bring them out, then that's where you start finding empathy. And then again, when you find empathy, you start finding understanding. We often avoid these difficult conversations, these controversial, complex conversations. And I wanted the podcast to be that. And it's not necessarily, it was never intended to just be law enforcement. I just happen to be a police chief. And there's a lot of topics when it becomes to policing and human behavior, human life. So it was like a good springing off of to go from law enforcement to seeing human behavior, seeing human life, and tackling those complex conversations, whether it is social justice, whether it's racial inequality, whether it's the human side of policing or addiction, whatever it is, or it's about psychological or mental health issues. Bringing those out in the open, and especially from a law enforcement perspective, from a police officer who can sit down and someone disagree with me and tell their side of it, I think that's where we start getting into a better understanding. So that's what it was really about. And I'm a big firm believer in empathy. And the only way you get through empathy is to communicate. So that's what the podcast is all about. Let's talk about these complex issues. Let's have a conversation about it. We don't have to agree. We don't have to solve anything. All we got to do is talk about it and put it on the table. And when you do that, you get more empathy. So the podcast has probably been one of the most rewarding things I've done because it's so cool to ask other people questions and to get inside their mind and their
Yes, it
perspective.
is.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's so cool
Hello.
because you know what you're lifting up the lid to the box and you're seeing
Yeah.
someone else's world, and it's really helped keep my mind open and keep it sharp, and I get to experience life from another, which is so cool. So I'm having a blast with it. It has been a lot of fun, and hopefully it can keep going, and we can have these challenging conversations. And then
Are these the kinds of, this the message you brought with you when you went to Washington to speak in front of, who was it, Homeland Security, or I'm
yeah,
not
the
sure
U.S.
who
Senate
it
Homeland
was.
Security
Yeah.
Security Subcommittee,
I
and
mean,
it
when you
was
talk to them, were you sharing this kind of perspective, this philosophy of yours with them?
we were at the time overwhelmed in the Cincinnati area. We were dealing with 50 to 70 overdoses and carfentanil hit. There was times Cincinnati police, just the police officers, were responding to 40 overdose calls a day. They were only responding to shootings and overdoses at the time. And it was born out of helplessness. And I sat in the subcommittee at the U.S. Senate and said, "We need help. We need you to help us. We're overwhelmed, and this cannot just be a law enforcement issue." It really centered around telling the stories that we were seeing on the street. And I gotta say that this has been one of the most bipartisan issues. All you see is the politics in DC, but this is one issue where Republicans, Democrats come and say, let me tell you my story in my community, because it's impacting everyone. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican, you have constituents that are dealing with this. So it was telling the human side, telling from the law enforcement that we didn't have the tools or resources to do this, that we were overwhelmed. And it was saying that we need you to step in and help, not just with funding, but help us bring more resources together, and end up being a significant partnership. And there's been quite a few laws that have come out of all this lobbying. I just was at a breakfast this morning, and we have a Republican who has led much of our addiction changes, from Good Samaritan laws to bringing Narcan on the street, legalizing fentanyl test strips. So this is one of those issues that has impacted a lot of people, and it really doesn't get so much into politics. So the DC stuff has been telling the stories of the human beings that suffer and struggle. It's been telling how we in law enforcement need help, that you cannot allow us in law enforcement to lead this. We need mental and medical health professionals to help out with it and build community. So the DC stuff, it's been very rewarding to be able to have a voice, be given a voice on Capitol Hill,
Yeah,
and then to have President Clinton invite me and speak about addiction with him
I was
a
going to
couple
mention
of
that.
times.
Yes.
Yeah, the Clinton Foundation has been
Foundation.
tremendous with this. And again, those voices open up a whole world that I and others would not have been able to access. And if anything, the testimony in the Senate, the having President Clinton invite me, having the Global Commission on Drugs invite me and share my message around the world has really opened up, given me a platform to be vulnerable, to be empathetic, and to be genuine and say we need to make changes. And the best piece of advice I ever got was from a mentor who told me, whenever you speak about addiction, do it in uniform, because people have a perception of what a police officer is, and you're
Yes.
speaking from a human being. And the more we speak as human beings, whether it is a teacher, law enforcement, a senator, a doctor, the more we speak as human beings, the more empathy we have, the more empathy have, more understanding, the more understanding, the more we find answers.
Were you also involved in some way with John Hopkins?
Yeah, that was the Clinton Foundation,
That's
did
the
a
Clinton
talk at Johns
Foundation.
Hopkins
Okay.
University. Yeah. I
Okay.
told people it was so strange because I'm on a stage with a former president of the United States, all of these CEOs, these senators and Congress people. And I told them, I go, this is actually the first time I've ever been to college. I'll get 0 credits for this. And
Oh
you're
my
all
gosh.
looking at me as the expert. What? What's going on
I would
here?
have had to take my lorazepam to be up there. I'm not sure I would have been a
Oh,
nervous wreck. You also make comments about the importance of being transparent, that law enforcement, as any other agency, makes mistakes, and it's important to be honest about your mistakes, to learn from your mistakes, and as you say, build a bank account that you can draw from down the road. And I think that that's so important, to keep in mind. If I was to ask you, well, I'm going to ask you, what your all right, before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about this perspective that you have of changing the relationship with your community and with what's going on in the community. I alluded to a poem that you wrote earlier, and we have the link on that poem on the website. And I would like to tell people a little bit about the background of that poem, because I think it's so important for them to, if you read nothing else about Chief, please look at his poem. It is amazing. I think she should be putting this out on in the New York Times, the front page. Could you tell us a little bit about the background of this poem that you wrote? What this had to have been a very emotional experience for you to be able to write something like this. Can you talk about this a little bit?
yeah, sure. So I had a
Create
father.
context for us. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a father who called me up at the station out of nowhere. He had seen me on the news talking about the epidemic. He called me and said, I need you to save my daughter. That's the first thing he said. And I go, well, I don't even know who you are. And he goes, my daughter is involved in prostitution. She's overdosed several times. She's been beaten severely, and she's in downtown Cincinnati. I need you to go get her. And I said, well, I don't work down there. I can't. And he was so simple in his arguments, and he and I would debate. We became close friends. He and I would debate religion and politics and music and all kinds of stuff, have these huge debates, but he was such a simple man when it came down to it that you literally could not argue with him. So the first time on the phone when I said, look, I can't go down there, it's kidnapping, he goes, well, aren't you the police? Aren't you supposed to help? And I was like, oh my gosh, how do I say no to him? And
Wow.
he literally goes, look, okay, if you can't go down there, how about you drive me and I'll snatch her up and put her in the car. We'll take her to treatment. I go, you just
Oh,
move me
wow.
to a different seat. That's still kidnapping. I can't be involved in
I'm
kidnapping. I'm
aiding and
sorry.
abetting
Yeah,
or whatever.
exactly. You just move me to a different seat. And
Right.
it really played into the whole Batman theory of although I could quote where it was illegal and quote unquote that would be wrong, how could you, and he would say this, how could a father wanting to save his daughter be wrong? And how do you argue that? So it really made me question a lot of the complexities of the law, what's right or wrong. Um, so that phone call led to he and I becoming close friends, constantly trying to work to save his daughter. And it became a community project. It was not just me trying to save her. Literally, the community came together. The Cincinnati Enquirer did a story. And if you're able to go back to I think it's Saving Dominique, that was the name of his daughter. Her name was Dominique. The father's name was Harold. They list on the back page 30 individuals and agencies that came together
Oh
to try
my
to save
God.
Dominique. Um, And we literally, it was almost, so Kentucky has this law called Casey's Law, where a judge and a medical professional can involuntarily commit someone into treatment. She was under that law, but she was living in Ohio. And the part where the poem comes in is we had made a deal. It was almost like in the way the Inquirer wrote it was like back in the Soviet Union or the Cold War days when you would take someone in one part of Germany and meet on the other side of Germany to set them free. And we had actually made a deal with North Kentucky. We were going to meet them in the middle of the bridge over the Ohio River
Oh,
and
like a movie.
yeah, exactly. And we were going to transfer Dominique to Kentucky so she could get treatment. But she was in jail and refusing help. And I sent one of my officers down there and to try to talk her into going because we needed her to voluntarily go. He called me up and said she refused. And then I talked to her on the phone, and it was a profound experience. And that's where the poem came from. Was I'd listened to this at times, this little girl who the father Harold always looked at, no matter what she was involved in, whether it was prostitution or drugs or overdosing or being beat, he always saw her as his princess. And I got to tell you, I had never seen unconditional love, grace at this level, the empathy at this level. It was listening to her. And at one point, she would talk like a 12-year-old. The voice was literally like a 12-year-old. And then when we started talking about, can we get you help and treatment? It was almost like this demonic voice came, and it was a completely different personality. And her voice changed, her character changed, and she was very mean and vile.
Oh,
And you just went back and forth. And for most people, they would have looked at Dominique as just labels. You're a prostitute, you're an addict, you're with a pimp, your life is not worth anything. But the father didn't see, although he didn't accept or condone that, he did only see her as his daughter, and he was doing this completely out of love. So it made me do the same thing. Everything we were doing was out of love, and it transformed into being bigger than me, Harold, and Dominique. It became a community coming together, trying to save Dominique, to keep her alive, to get her well. And this community did it out of love. And I'm telling you, there was a lot, whether it was journalists who were paying for stuff on their own, whether it was police officers who were doing things to try to save her life, who would drive her name. I told this story about, she was on the front page of this article, and every officer knew her. So they were constantly looking out for her. They were protecting her. Dominique became this person in the city of Cincinnati, the Hampden County area, that we all kind of sheltered. And Harold ended up developing brain cancer. And he and I's relationship was pretty short, probably about a year and a half, because of brain cancer, he ended up succumbing to it pretty quickly. But the goal then became, can we keep Dominique alive long enough so Harold knows that she was alive? Hard. We
yes,
did.
it is. You did. Do you keep in touch with her? Do you still keep in
We
touch with
did for
her?
a long time. We did for several years, but we've all kind of lost track of her. We've not heard anything bad,
Right.
but we don't have that relationship. She, and I liken it back to the daughter of the oldest brother. When she was on the podcast, she told me something so profound. She said, I used to run from you officers because you showed me empathy, and empathy scared me. I
Oh,
was used to being looked at as worthless. And when people said that you're not worth anything, you're a piece of crap, she's like, I agree with that. So I gravitated to them. I ran from you. And Dominique was kind of the same way. Dominique was not very happy that we had, because she became familiar with the despair, and she feared that hope.
that goes back to the quote you were talking about before.
Yeah. So
Familiarity of despair is stronger
then the fear
than
of hope.
the fear of hope.
Yeah,
Yes.
so she was not very happy with us at times. And so we kind of lost track of her, but I know there's a lot of people that personally had relationships with her, try to help her out. And hopefully one day she will be able to be in a position where she can tell her story and talk about it from her perspective, and hopefully be well. But it was the power of a father's love, this unconditional love, this incredible grace, and the power of that love to transform not just her, but an entire community. When I say the community, it was everything from journalists to judges to police officers, firefighters to people who didn't even know Dominique, who
Right.
would go out and try to help her and look for her. The entire community came together to try to save this one person. It was this power of love, but it also showed how difficult it was for someone in addiction like that to make it through, and how many people it took just to keep one person alive. So it became this powerful story of not only love, but the hurdles we faced. And we've come a long way since the days of Dominique, and the community has really embraced the substance use disorder and seeing the human before they see the addiction, and making a change in the way they view and deal with addiction. And that is evident in our reduction of overdose deaths, and to have a coalition start from a dozen people to now 700 people in 250 separate organizations. That is the power of community, and Harold and his daughter Dominique played a major role in that.
It kind of goes back to the old quote of it takes a village, to raise a child. It takes a village. You also, I'm going to say, in something that I read of yours, I don't remember, you said that it's not a dichotomy when law enforcement makes decisions. It's not just about right and wrong, but it's about love. You have to do it from your heart. It's about love. We're going to have to kind of wind down a little bit, and I'm wondering if there's anything last words that you would like to say that maybe we didn't get into, or a message that you would like to put out there before we sign off.
I was thinking about all this conversation and going back to the sergeant who told me not to get personally involved.
Okay.
It really was being personally involved, and it is challenging. It is heartbreaking at times. It is very triumphant at times. I would tell people to be courageous enough to be vulnerable, because when you're that courageous, it opens up your mind, and then you can have some empathy, and in that empathy, we have understanding. And I often tell people, look, life and being a human being is complex. I agree. Every time you have any opinion you have can be valid. The only one I won't validate is just letting people die. So if we can be open enough to be vulnerable, if we can question what really is right or wrong, yes, there may be morals, and maybe ethics, and maybe against the law, but I've really come to question what is right or wrong. And if we can make decisions out of compassion, out of love, if we can have some boundaries, if we can be empathetic, I think we can make a bigger impact in our community, in our lives, and those that we share it with.
It's wonderful. I love talking to you. It's so uplifting. I really appreciate your words of wisdom. And the question, of course, is we talked about this also, is who are the real heroes, the police or the people who overcome some of the challenges that you are so involved in trying to support them in this journey. I don't know about the rest of our listeners, but after speaking with Chief Synan, I need time to calm down and digest some of the richness of his words and the truths that he's shared with us. I hope that someone, even if only one person, goes back to their office and brings back empathy, vulnerability, and a willingness to reach out and connect. We'll be able to begin the process of making some changes. If you are able to reach out to, again, Chief Synan, I know he would be anxious, willing, and ready to talk with you about any ideas that you have or any questions that you may have. If you can do this in your community, then we'll begin to make a difference. I also hope that if you do this, that you will reach out to me, because I would like to share what it is that you are doing. Please be safe and stay connected. Thank you so much for being with us.